allow each of our panelists to give a brief introduction. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start with our host, Nelson Peacock. Nelson, if you could begin, and then I'll call each other guest by name to allow them the opportunity to introduce themselves.
Well, thanks, Denise, and hi, everyone. My name is Nelson Peacock. I am the president and CEO of the Northwest Arkansas Council, which is a regional nonprofit focused on economic development and quality of life here in Northwest Arkansas.
Okay, and next I'm going to have Ambassador Wisner introduce himself.
Denise, thank you very much, and I'm pleased to be with you, Mr. Hendricks, Mr. Peacock, and the honor of addressing the council to be joined today with Matthew Kirk from Great Britain. Rodney Slater, I believe, is on as well, and my colleague Frank Simolas. My introductory remarks will focus on foreign policy, but let me open with a pretty obvious contention, and that is we're about 100 days, just over, into the Biden presidency. I listened very carefully, as I assume many of you did, to his address to Congress, which awoke in me a sense of drama about this moment in our nation's history. I was particularly moved by the president's call for a broad national regeneration, a revival of our institutions, our governing principles, our education system, our infrastructure, as well as our economy. The challenge to foreign policy at the same time, the theme of my remarks today, is no less daunting. The January 20th found United States foreign policy and our place in the world badly frayed. Our relations with our great power neighbors, China and Russia, strained, our allies alienated, unpredictable to our trading partners, our trade practices and policies, widespread distrust in Latin America and Africa, broken ties to multilateral institutions. And here I pause simply to underscore that overall, the United States entered this year with a lack of purpose and direction in our foreign policy, and absent particularly a principle of trust. The question of trust is key to the conduct of foreign relations for any government at any time in history. So I am pretty convinced that it didn't all start with Joe Biden. To be frank, the situation we faced was not solely cannot solely be laid to the doorstep of Donald Trump, even though he is president, aggravated circumstances we currently face. From the end of World War II, it is worth recalling the United States exercised unmatched, dominant global power. But that advantage is no longer with us. That advantage cannot be retrieved. The core challenge to American foreign policy, to Biden and his successors, is how the United States will adjust to a new reality, a world in which we are a key player, but not a dominant factor. But let me be absolutely clear. I don't share the Chinese leadership's views that the United States is in systemic decline, but we do face an uphill climb. It's far from clear today that governments worldwide, both friends and adversaries, are persuaded we can overcome our domestic challenges and provide certainty to our policies and a responsible outcome in which others on the outside will be able to trust that decisions reached by one administration will be carried forward by its successors. So we've got to get our house in order, and domestic policy is therefore foreign policy. That leads, of course, to the evident conclusion in my mind, I suspect in many of yours, that the priorities the president and his administration have set out to deal with COVID, to deal with the economy, to deal with our domestic political order are absolutely the right priorities. But in foreign policy, it's been a spirited 90 days plus. Uh, we have seen a reversal of the Trump administration's policies. We've rejoined the climate agreement in Paris, the WTO, the WHO, the International Criminal Court, and we've agreed with Russia to reopen negotiations for New START. Biden has also put in place a high-quality diplomatic team, national security team that should give all of us some confidence we're in good hands. He has elevated climate change to a top position in our foreign policy, merited by the fact that we do face with climate an existential issue. He's drawn as well our attention to the crisis in the Southern Triangle that's produced the flood of refugees at our border and replaced development as a key driving force in dealing with the origins of this crisis. Biden has drawn very sharp lines with Russia and China, and I don't expect those lines to be retracted anytime soon. After a bit of delay, we're now negotiating our way with the Iranians over the nuclear agreement, and with some possibility, but still far from certain, that we can bring that negotiation to a conclusion. We are as well facing an entirely different situation the president has called for the withdrawal of our forces from Afghanistan. Tremendously important, not only for Afghanistan, Central Asia, but it's a signal to the world that endless war is not going to be an instrument of American national policy. So if I take a step back with all of you and look at the first 100 days, I'm going to argue that the Biden and his administration are off to a fast start. But there are other themes that are beginning to emerge. I'm going to touch on 4 that I think will determine Biden's place in our history. The first theme, broadly defined, is a return to a world of cooperative internationalism, a decision to cooperate, to make clear that the United States shares power but does not dominate power. And we will make our way in the world more as a catalyst than as a leader, quote unquote, American leadership, as opposed to the United States as a catalyst. Core to our success will be our ability to convene others around us to deal with challenges to the world's order. Let's look at 2, climate change. The president, in convoking world leaders to prepare for the fall climate change summit, is creating a consensus-based catalytic moment in our lives. His decision to manage our differences with China by recruiting allies in the Quad, Japan, Australia, India, to join us, another example of a shared internationalism. The second principle is one that takes me back to my mathematics books, separation of principles, separation of variables. That is, the United States will pursue foreign policy even when there are contradictions inside the variables in the equation. We will pursue a responsible relationship with Saudi Arabia, for example, even when we have differences with Saudi domestic policies. We'll do the same with Russia, with China. And I believe over time, we, Russia, and China will find ways, and the direction will be to find ways to confront where we have real differences, to compete vigorously, and to cooperate whenever possible. We need a stable and predictable set of relations, and that will be the objective. I'm also convinced that there will be a new epoch, my third principle, of calm and determination, deliberation. particularly restoring a sense of communications with allies, even adversaries, and deliberating very carefully, restoring consultations at home with the Congress and within the stakeholders of our federal system. Fourth, I believe the Biden era will reestablish firmly in the eyes of the world our commitment to democracy and human rights, not just as matters of principle, but as weapons in our defense. For after all, when the world looks at the differences between us, Russia, and China, our commitment to democracy and human rights gives us powerful tools. I'm not going to pretend in closing that the road ahead is easy. It is indeed long, and it's going to be difficult. We have to restore a sense of strategy in our management of great power relations. We're going to have to manage crises. Taiwan jumps to the top of my list. North Korea doesn't fall far behind, and how we withdraw from Afghanistan will be a real test to this administration. We're going to have to figure out how to put real substance into a climate change agenda, and looking closer at home to this hemisphere in time, figure out how to manage our ties to Cuba and Venezuela as we look at our neighborhood. The global recovery, economic recovery from COVID is another challenge. How we deal with the heavily indebted nations of the world and the global trading system. And then finally, to bring into line our ambitions to have a reasonable nuclear posture and the huge cost demands of an update in our nuclear system. So the first 100 days, in my judgment, are but a beginning. They're a good start. There's a lot ahead, but the priorities are increasingly clear and spelled out. We turn the floor back over to you, Mr. Peacock.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I think we're going to go to Ambassador Kirk now.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you all for the opportunity to speak to you. I'm going, as it were, to give a European response, not in the sense of a rebuttal, but how the picture described by Ambassador Wisner of the Biden international objectives and ambitions looks from across the Atlantic. And I'm going to use the term European to mean Europeans, including the United Kingdom. There'll be times when I talk about the EU, which obviously no longer includes the United Kingdom, and that in itself brings an interesting dynamic into the transatlantic relationship. And let me start by saying that those qualities of engagement, of rebuilding of trust, the agenda that Ambassador Wisner outlined is very much on display in London today, with the meeting of the foreign ministers of the G7, and a strikingly positive set of meetings yesterday between Secretary Blinken and his British counterpart, Dominic Raab, and a strong sense that between the US and the UK, there is again, as there has on for much of the last 60 or 70 years, been a very positive agenda on the international stage. I think the reconvening of the G7, and I know that this was seen as an enormously important moment, actually to get people back into the room together, is a really important part in itself of re-establishing the proper tempo of international engagement and international relations. You can achieve an awful lot on the sort of technology that we're using, and it's wonderful that we have it. But there comes a point when the ability to have a face-to-face conversation, even if you have a plastic screen between your faces, is very important. And so I think the symbolism of the G7 coming together physically and I know the British Prime Minister is very determined that it will come together physically again at head of government level with President Biden present in the beginning of June for a G7 Heads of Summit meeting. That ability to convene a group of leaders of very important countries which share something in common. What is that something? And this was something that Ambassador Wisner put emphasis on. What they share in common is democracy. And inviting to join that group a number of other leading democracies like South Korea, Australia, India, and so forth. A very important piece of symbolism to show to the world that something that has been seen as being increasingly under challenge, that democracy is a weak political system that is incapable of handling social pressures and incapable of handling social development and crises. This is a demonstration, and intentionally a demonstration, that there is life in democracy yet, and that democracy can still provide a standard of international relationships and international objective setting that has value. And the link, obviously, between democracy and human rights, as Ambassador Wisner said, is a hugely important one. So if you're sitting in Europe and you're looking across the Atlantic, what do you see? I think the first thing to say is that there is no doubt at all which way Europe voted in the US presidential election. Europeans are almost unanimously tremendously pleased to see President Biden in office, to be dealing with a US administration that they see as having some of the characters of engagement and predictability that has been a feature of US administrations over the years, but was perhaps less evident over the past 4 years. So there is a genuine welcome for this re-engagement and a genuine welcome for the agenda that the US is seeking to pursue. And I would say that's particularly important on what's probably the #1 issue facing us all, which is climate change. The absence of the US from international engagement on climate change over the last 4 years has made it very hard to make progress. Now there is a real sense that with the COP26 meeting happening towards the end of this year, with the Biden administration fully re-engaged, as the summit at the end of last month demonstrated, with the very important appointment of John Kerry, that real progress can be made on climate change, and the world can come back together to tackle a global problem. So on that major central issue, a huge welcome for US re-engagement. A huge welcome for US multilateralism. Obviously the rejoining of the Paris Accords, very important for climate change, as Ambassador Wisner mentioned, the WTO, the World Health Organization, the International Criminal Court, and so forth. All of these, the re-establishment of a nuclear negotiating framework with Russia, all of these are seen very positively indeed. And Ambassador Wisner's remarks about the quality of the US diplomatic team has also been widely welcomed in Europe. I would say that there is a difference, clearly, between European attitudes to US engagement now and European attitudes to US engagement looking back to, say, 5 years ago and before. And that difference is brought about by two things. One is that, as Ambassador Wisner said, there is a question, there is an inevitable question. It's great to have the Biden administration, it's great to be engaged, it's great to be setting a policy, but how long will this engagement last? Does it only last 4 years and then we change gear again and move to a different way of operating, or is the US permanently back in this mode of operation? And so that question, I think, sits there. I think the other dimension, which is perhaps less visible across the Atlantic, is that the European Union in particular has become very used to being a global leader. If you look at privacy regulation with the General Data Protection Regulation, the European Union discovered the ability to lay down the law to the world and to become, in effect, a global regulator. The European Union has become very used to being the international standard setter on climate change, is now looking at standards on things like taxation of the digital economy, how artificial intelligence will operate and so forth, which it expects to be the global standard. And the advent of the Biden administration and its engagement on these issues is therefore a challenge to how the European Union has come to see itself over the last 5 years. And that, I think, will be a cause for some friction as we go forward in a whole raft of areas which are enormously important for the way in which we tackle some of these global challenges. I'll mention one because I think it's underpriced at the moment, but is a very important one, which is there are moves on both sides of the Atlantic to address frameworks for how companies report on their non-financial disclosures. And if you're sitting in a multinational company, obviously you hope that the US, the EU, the UK, Japan, Australia, Canada will all take roughly similar decisions so that you can basically, as you do with your financial accounts, do the same thing and publish it on different sheets of paper for the different regulatory, to meet the different regulatory requirements. It's not clear to me that that's where the debate is going to go, because I think the Biden administration has its understanding of how it wants this issue to develop. The EU has its understanding. The ability of those two in particular to come together on this quite technical, but from a business point of view, absolutely crucial issue is not yet evident. And the willingness of them both to accept, both the US administration and the EU, that this is a matter of shared leadership and not of a single leading view to which others rally, has yet to be demonstrated. I hope it will be demonstrated. I hope it'll be demonstrated on that and many other issues in the course of this year. But it's a new habit that needs to grow and develop across the Atlantic. In that context, let me say a brief word about Brexit as well, because the role that the United Kingdom played as a member of the European Union in the transatlantic relationship is well known and well documented. The role the United Kingdom will play in the future, I think, is obviously going to be different, no longer a member of the European Union. Clearly still a key member of NATO and an important part of the European contribution to NATO. But the reflexes of old in London, in Brussels and other European capitals and in Washington will not work in the same way as a result of Brexit. And this is another area where all of the actors are going to need to learn new ways of working and new ways of operating that vitally important transatlantic relationship. Secretary Blinken's comments in London yesterday about the importance to the US of the relationship with the UK were very striking in the UK. They will have been very striking in the rest of Europe as well. Finally, let me just pick up very quickly on some of the themes that Ambassador Wisner mentioned. As I said, climate change, the most important, and one where there is a broad and very important harmony between what Europeans want and the direction that the Biden administration is heading in. Coming out of COVID, economic recovery, all those kinds of things, absolutely the same. I think there are two areas in particular where the EU-US or European-US relationship could get more difficult. Actually, it is more EU-US because on these two, the UK looks to be lining up more closely with the US than perhaps some other European countries. And those two are both hugely important ones, Russia and China. On Russia, there is widespread popular revulsion at the behavior of the Putin regime. Alexei Navalny obviously has become an encapsulation of that revulsion, but he is by no means the only element in it, and whatever his destiny holds, unless the Putin regime changes in a way that nobody expects it to, that revulsion will continue. But at the same time, for a number of countries, and principally Europe's largest economy, Germany, the economic link to Russia is seen as hugely important. And there is also a reflex on the part more of Western Europeans, excluding the UK, so France, as well as Germany, that engagement with Russia is a good thing, because disengagement with Russia, confrontation with Russia, leads you back to scenarios of destruction in the early 1940s, which no one wants to revisit under any circumstances. And within that, you have some very important economic links, and most symbolic and important of all, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which is seen by some as an essential part of allowing Germany to pursue its policy of closing down nuclear power stations while not becoming reliant on coal, and therefore exacerbating the climate change carbon emissions situation. But is seen by others as a way for Putin to make critical parts of the European economy dependent on Russia, and therefore open to pressure from Russia. It's also seen in the context that it bypasses Central European countries, it bypasses Ukraine, and therefore affects the way in which those countries see the possibility of a negative evolution of relations with Russia. So European attitudes towards Russia are very complex, very difficult to navigate, and much harder to line up in a clear and coherent way on the sort of agenda that Ambassador Wisner described as being the Biden agenda. China is, if anything, even more complex. China is seen as a strategic challenge to Europe, but China is also an increasingly important economic partner to major European countries. And again, I come back to Germany. China is Germany's largest economic partner. 5 years ago, it was the US. Now it is China. And the Europeans, and the European Union in particular, is trying to strike a different path, a sort of middle path between where it perceives the US to be heading and China. It has tried that on the first sort of big issue to run on this agenda, Huawei. Some European countries have moved much closer to a US position on Huawei. Others have remained more open to Chinese technology. But across the board, the EU is reluctant to create the sorts of linkages with human rights, with the treatment of the Uyghur population, with Hong Kong. It's not that these issues will not be raised by Europeans, but they are raised in a separate context to the economic context and developments they want to see there. And the EU, I think, made a significant tactical error in rushing at the end of last year between the result of the presidential election and the inauguration of President Biden to conclude an investment pact with China. There was no need to get it done so quickly, and some consultation with the incoming US administration would have been a sensible thing to do. As it happens, because of Chinese actions in Hong Kong and towards the Uyghur population, since this pact was put through, I think it will actually face considerable difficulty in being ratified by the European Parliament. There is a groundswell of European popular opinion that China cannot be seen to be getting away with its current behavior. And so to some extent, there is a disjunct between the political leadership of key European countries and the European institutions in Brussels and emerging European popular opinion on both Russia and China. And that will also have the potential to become a source of tension across the Atlantic. Let me finish at that point. I'm sure we can take any questions you have about any specific issues or about this dynamic across the Atlantic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Kirk. A couple of things. First, if you have a question, you can put it in the chat, and we'll get to those at the end. And then I want to turn it over to Secretary Slater now. Because of technology issues, we didn't really get to do a proper introduction of Secretary Slater, but Secretary Slater, former, just a great champion of Arkansas, and obviously former cabinet secretary under President Clinton, transportation secretary, and despite just a few years living in DC now, still has Arkansas close to his heart, does a lot of work in the Delta, and is a great friend of Northwest Arkansas, always making time for us and making sure that we have opportunities like this to learn how these global issues are affecting our local businesses. So Secretary Slater, we appreciate you putting this together and appreciate your time today. So I'll turn it over to you now.
Well, thank you, Nelson. And let me, first of all, commend you for your leadership of the Northwest Arkansas Council, clearly one of the most formidable business organizations with an academic element to it as well, and a lot of community leaders also. But one of the most significant premier economic engines anywhere in the country. And so I commend you for your leadership. Let me also say to Dan and to Denise, we really appreciate the leadership that they have provided and continue to provide with the Arkansas World Trade Center and the work that they've helped to offer to put this forum together. And then finally, to my colleagues, Ambassador Wisner, Ambassador Kirk, and I also have another colleague on the call, Frank Samolis. Frank actually heads our Global International Trade Practice Group. And so when we get into the Q&A, we can turn to the three of them. But Arkansas, as you know, is a significant exporter. Most people don't know that aerospace is our #1 export industry. And then you've got all of the agricultural products. You've got the great retailers with Walmart leading the way, and all of your, your meat products, poultry, and the like, with Tyson's. Clearly, some of the major transportation and logistics businesses to be found any place in the country. And then a lot of small businesses that export, that seek to utilize our supply chain to access markets across the country and around the world. And so it is our pleasure to be with you to have this audience to talk to those business leaders. With that, what I'd like to do is really come back to you, Nelson, so that we get into the question and answer session, because we really want this to be an opportunity for you and to hear from the businesses that you have in your organization and to try to respond to their questions. Know that if we get to a point where we have to conclude things and there's still a follow-up, we'll all be available. We'll provide contact information and you all can stay in touch with us. But let me just say that I think we have a wonderful moment here with a president who has engaged the world to say we're back. We are going to compete at every turn. We're going to offer no quarter, nor ask for one. We are here to compete. That's the thing that he led with after his 2.5-hour meeting with Xi Jinping. Now, his staff hurried to say yes, and you talked about these other issues so as to check all of the boxes, but you could tell that his focus during that conversation was on the fact that we are here to compete. We'll collaborate where we can, and we'll compete where we have to. And that message, I think, came through loud and clear from both Ambassadors Wisner and Kirk. So with that, let me just come back to you, Nelson. And if there's a little time at the end, maybe we can say a little bit about transportation and infrastructure. But again, in this trade month of May, World Trade Month, we very much appreciate the opportunity for this time to discuss these important issues with Arkansas businesses.
Great. Yeah, so there is one question in the chat about Nord Stream 2, which I think Ambassador Kirk covered
Yes.
in his remarks. I don't know, Ambassador Kirk, if you wanted any reason to elaborate on what you touched on, given the question in the chat.
It's a hard question to answer. I'd say two things. First of all, a lot depends on how the US approaches the issue. And as I understand it, but Ambassador Wisner would be much better placed to comment than me, there are congressional pressures on the administration to act on this issue. But the second dimension to it is that Germany has elections towards the end of this year. Nord Stream 2 has been a particularly important project for the outgoing Chancellor Angela Merkel, and she has championed it, although it was originally a project of her political opponents. And she has been the one who has defended it and has borne the brunt of a lot of the criticism of it coming from the United States. She is not standing again in the election. Whatever happens, she will no longer be German Chancellor. And the way the polls are shaping up at the moment, we could well see a very different kind of German government, one which has either leadership by the Green Party or a significant role for the Green Party within it. The Green Party is not keen on Nord Stream 2, both for reasons of the relationship with Russia and human rights, but also because they think that it is perpetuating Germany's dependence on fossil fuels, when actually what needs to happen is to accelerate the transition of the German economy to renewable energy. So Nord Stream 2, I think, is highly dependent on how the US administration approaches it, and I'd be very interested in Ambassador Wisner's comments on that, but also highly dependent on the outcome of the German elections. Either of those two could determine whether it is a permanent sore or whether it's manageable.
Mm-hmm. Is Ambassador Wisner still with us? Did you want to offer any comments, Mr. Ambassador?
A very quick word,
Yeah.
because I agree with what Matthew had to say. I mean, I see a way to resolve the Nord Stream matter. I can understand the framework, but it's going to be hard. The way you would resolve it is finish it, but then be very careful about the volume of hydrocarbons that flow through, and limit the Russian intrusion on European energy markets. But that's a kind of out there I think the administration is going to approach this very warily. The priority the president and his team have at the moment is to secure passage of these very large and vitally important bills covering infrastructure, covering education, covering our future. And he's going to try hard to get Republican support as he seeks passage. It's not possible for me to say yet how successful he will be, how the bargaining will play out, but I'm quite convinced that one of the driving forces in the Biden administration will be to limit the number of disagreements that he would have with his Republican colleagues, and not pick fights on tertiary issues. And I would argue that that will explain a bit of why we are dragging our feet on Cuba, on Venezuela, and not looking for a fight with the Europeans over Nord Stream 2 as examples of a caution. If we can get past these bills, then there's more flexibility in American diplomacy, and the kind of ideal outcome that I described becomes more possible, taking into account particularly the German election and German politics, which we have to deal with if at the end of an election there.
Thank you.
Okay, we had some questions submitted earlier, and so I'll just post those, and Secretary Slater, you can address them or ask some of the panelists to address
Okay.
them. The first one is, what's next for U.S. trade and American small business, given in this new post-Brexit world?
You know, I think I hope Frank is on. Frank, have you called in this morning? Let me just see if you're there.
Yes, I'm here, Rodney.
Oh, good. Frank, I think that would be a great call for you. And let me just say thanks for calling in. Yesterday, we got a sense of some of the questions, and I thought you'd be just perfect for these, for a few of these. So would you like to take that one, Frank?
Sure. Thank you, Rodney. And thank you for inviting me. It's always a pleasure and an honor to share the virtual stage with Ambassadors Kirk and Wisner. So happy to be here. Just by way of background, I'm the co-chair of the international trade practice at Squire Patton Boggs. And I am very closely involved in trade policy, both under the Trump administration and the Biden administration. Very quick background. The Biden trade policy is not going to be dramatically different from the Trump trade policy. Everybody that thought that the tariffs on China and the steel tariffs would be removed immediately were in for a shock. I think the Biden administration's approach to trade, they themselves call it worker-centric. Mm-hmm. They are putting a higher priority on how any trade initiative is going to benefit the American worker. And by implication, I believe that also means small business. Small business in the US will benefit greatly from the Biden administration's emphasis not only on worker-centric trade, but also on the embrace of Buy America, which he mentioned in his joint speech to Congress last week. Buy America, he underlined, has been on the books for a while. He claimed it does not violate our international trade obligations. It depends on how that's implemented, but I think it's clear that this administration is going to do everything it can within the limits of our international obligations to promote small business, to protect them from foreign competition, particularly with respect to procurement in the United States. And it's my guess, Rodney, that his trade philosophy and negotiating with others is going to reflect a deep concern for the American worker and small business. He faces some legal difficulties in his authority to negotiate future agreements. So that's still up in the air, but it doesn't prevent him from talking to our trading partners. I think he will be much more protective of small business. Because of Buy America, he will be much more in a position to promote small business. So I think this will be a much better climate for small business in Arkansas. For those that are looking to have retaliatory tariffs removed, not so much, but that's generally where I think this administration is going.
Frank, can you say a little bit about the U.S. trade rep and her reputation?
Sure. Thank you, Rodney. She's a friend of the firm, Catherine Tai. She came from the Ways and Means Committee, where she was chief trade counsel. Before that, she was at the U.S. Trade Representative and actually headed up China enforcement. So there's no question that she's going to be very attuned to a competitive posture with China on trade and will not be shy at all about taking an aggressive posture on trade policy. The other thing I should mention, Rodney, in addition to Catherine Tai, it was just announced this morning that the new Directorate General of the World Trade Organization has appointed her 4 deputies. One of the deputies will be a woman by the name of Angela Ellard, who was a longtime trade counsel to the Ways and Means Committee. She headed up the Republican side, was basically the counterpart to Catherine Tai. So for US trade policy, there's now a friend in the WTO. I should add, this new Director General is very dynamic. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala is her name. She was former finance minister of Nigeria, number 2 at the World Bank, a woman, an African woman. I think she's going to bring a lot of dynamism. So the one point where I think we have some optimism, both Ambassador Kirk and Wisner mentioned the WTO. I think Ngozi will bring new energy to the WTO, and to the extent there are new negotiations, the fact that she is willing to be all-inclusive and abrasive, and the fact that Angela Ellard will now be a deputy bodes well for any multilateral trade discussions.
Thank you, Frank. Nelson, maybe I'll come back to you for another question or two.
Sure. Well, there's one in the chat, and we'll just go to that one.
Okay.
Basically, I'll read it from Carol Williams. What influence will actions and reactions in the Middle East, particularly Saudi Arabia and Iran, have on European climate decisions?
We've done some work for Saudi Arabia, so I know Frank has a history of that with that, but I'd also ask our ambassadors to chime in as well. But Frank, you want to start with that, maybe?
Yeah, could you repeat it, please? The connection drifted off.
Oh yeah.
Sure. It says, what influence will actions and reactions in the Middle East, particularly Saudi Arabia and Iran, have on European climate decisions?
I think that's more in the realm of Ambassador Kirk.
Okay. Yeah.
So I would turn it over to Matthew.
Okay.
Thank you. It's an interesting question, and I mean I'm not 100% sure what's behind the question. If it's about US actions in relation to Saudi Arabia and Iran and the EU-US or European-US ability to work together on climate change, I don't think that will have any effect. The EU and UK line up pretty closely with the US on Iran. The re-engagement to try to get the JCPOA re-established is very positively seen in Europe. I think there are doubts in Europe, as there are in the US, about how much progress it'll be possible to make with Iran, but I think the relationship is pretty close there. Saudi Arabia, there may be a little bit of difference on, but it's nuances of difference, not major difference. Saudi Arabia is seen as a very important economic and political partner in Europe as well. But I also think, from a European perspective, the single most important issue for the world to confront is climate change. And if there is a positive shared agenda between Europe and the US on climate change, that is massively important, and no other issue will derail that. There may well be differences on Russia, China, as I mentioned earlier, but that will absolutely not derail working together on climate change, which in the European body politic, and if you look at recent European elections, I mentioned the prospect of a Green Party important role in government, or potentially even leadership of the German government. That would have been unthinkable a decade ago. Today it is absolutely conceivable, because the need to tackle climate change is now deeply embedded in the European voting population. And you struggle to find a political party in a European country that is not committed to tackling climate change.
Yes.
Rodney, could I add just a quick word to that?
Yes, Mr. Ambassador, please. Thank you.
I think the question's very good, and it's a very important one in the following sense, that America's relations with Europe depend heavily on Europe's prosperity, Europe's ability to manage its economy. And if we've learned one thing about the Middle East, notably about friction between Saudi Arabia and Iran over the past decade, as well as ructions on the Arab street, the Middle East is a very, very volatile region. And if you can, not only for climate change reasons, but if you can begin to manage your hydrocarbons in a way that leaves you less dependent on the volatility of the Middle East, you're clearly better off. We have a stake in that as well. We need to be sure we contribute to stability in the Middle East. Europe is not only energy dependent on the Middle East, but look at the disruption of refugee flows. So our interests and European interests in a stable region, of coming up with ways of calming differences in the region. And frankly, I would point everybody in the last several days to signals from Saudi Arabia that the Saudis will start talking to the Iranians is a good move, one that we should all welcome and encourage. The way we in Europe need to stand is right in the middle of the Gulf, neither on the Arab side nor on the Iranian side, but building bridges across it.
Excellent point, Mr. Ambassador. And Frank, I don't know that this is necessary, but we have a big presence in the Middle East. We've had a number of offices there for a number of years. Do you want to say just a little bit about that, maybe to close this out?
Sure, Ronnie. We have, as you know, a long history and presence in the Middle East. We were the first American law firm to be given a license to practice in Qatar. We have represented at one time or another all of the members of the Gulf Cooperation Council. I have advised them on trade issues on various matters. And we now have offices, as you know, Rodney, in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, Dubai, and Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. So we have had an ongoing relationship. We have represented Saudi Arabia in Washington for a number of years, as well as several other of those countries in the Gulf, plus our representation of several of the sovereign wealth funds. So you're exactly right, Rodney. We have a long and deep historical relationship in that region.
Okay, very good. Nelson, I'm looking at the time. I know we've had just a great discussion, and it's about the the 11 o'clock hour here, Eastern Standard Time. Can I just say one thing about the infrastructure measure? The president has really made infrastructure a centerpiece of his Build Back Better plan. I think that's good for Arkansas. Arkansas has always respected its place sort of in the center of the country, and the fact that many major interstates pass through the state. We've got a big trucking community delivering products across the country and around the world. Major railroads passing through the states, significant waterways, whether it's the Mississippi or the Arkansas or whatever. And I just think that we have a wonderful opportunity to benefit here. I think Secretary Buttigieg is really an inspired choice. He was not on the list of those to be considered for the position initially. You had a number of people who had been, deputy secretaries or in the department, all eminently qualified. A number of mayors from larger cities, eminently qualified as well. But he brought something, I think, rather unique to the challenge of the responsibility of the office currently. And that's being able to put in words and through poetry and prose, really sing the message of this administration again, that infrastructure is central to its economic agenda. I think Secretary Buttigieg can do that quite capably. I believe that we're going to find him not only on the Sunday programs, but really going to all quarters of the media community to take that message forward. He's going to hit the ground running. And I think that it bodes well, as I've said, for Arkansas, much like the environment we had some years ago, really during the Clinton administration, when we were able to move on the airport in Northwest Arkansas, the Bobby Hopper Tunnel, the completion of 540, a number of the major infrastructure investments that we've made across the state over time. So I'm excited about this moment as well. We'll be calling on the delegation. They'll all have to express themselves as it relates to this infrastructure package, which totals about 2.2 trillion. We'll see how that plays out. But as has been said earlier, I think the president wants to work with the Congress. And so that means working by partisanly, and we'll just see where that goes. But I think that bodes well for Arkansas as well, along with these trade agreements and a focus on international trade policy. So we thank you for the opportunity to come to you today. I really, really appreciate Ambassadors Kirk and Wisner, and I'm very pleased, Frank, that you could join us at the last minute when we got some sense of what some of the questions would be. And again, Nelson, thank you for your leadership of the Northwest Arkansas Council, and Dan and Denise. We couldn't have better leadership at the Arkansas World Trade Center. So we very much appreciate this opportunity to be with you today.
Well, thank you all, and thank you for giving us here in Northwest Arkansas a little window into the world. I know there's some questions we didn't get to. It's a big world and a lot of issues to cover in 1 hour. So, so hopefully we can do it again sometime. And you're right about infrastructure. You know, we're growing 30 people a day. Every bond issue that's passed up here has infrastructure built in. A 0.5-cent sales tax is built into the Constitution now. So Arkansans are investing in their own infrastructure. And so we'll look forward to the federal government doing its part as well.
Excellent. And we're willing to come back. And Nelson, if you've got some of those questions, just pass those along. We may be able to circle back with people and do that online.
Okay. Sounds good. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.